Ladies and gentlemen, I've published a new book, The Global Trump. The subtitle is US Structural Populism and New Conflicts with Europe and Asia. So this is a book which asks the question, what has really happened after the 2016 election and why was Donald Trump elected? Why did he get a majority and what are the implications of this and his economic policy? So one might think, a US populist has become president and sooner or later there will be a change in office and then the US is back to normal. I would say that this is not a realistic assumption. The US has indeed a structural US populism problem in the following sense, that the drivers for the Trump majority are still valid and they will be strong for many years to come. The background for this is actually a paper by a US and a Swedish sociologist, so Linda and McCall. It's a paper from 2018. I had the privilege to enjoy then the presentation in New York by Mrs. McCall at a UN conference, and the paper basically says this with respect to survey results on the United States. It says that there is a majority of Americans who think you can climb up the economic ladder through hard work. There is also a majority who holds the view that there is too much inequality in the US now. It's an unfair economic inequality, so it's really big. And I can emphasize this by pointing out to some of the figures, some of the statistics from the inequality research from the Piketty group. Thomas Piketty and his research group, they have shown that the lower half of US income earners, they had a share in market income, in national GDP of 21% in 1981, but it was only 13% in 2015. So this is a dramatic change. This is a dramatic rise in inequality in the US. It's not comparable to what we see in the EU, where at the same time period, there has also been an increase in inequality, but only a slight one, as the share of the lower half of income earners has fallen from 22% in 1981 to about 20% in 2015. So the book looks, of course, at the drivers of this rising inequality in the US, but I'm coming back to this Lynn McCall paper. The survey results have a third and most important finding, and this is to say that there's a relative majority of US respondents who holds the view that this inequality should be corrected, should be reduced by big companies. This, however, is wishful thinking. I mean, how could it happen in an economy with big companies all quoted on stock markets that they would, let's say, reduce the remuneration of top managers by 10-20%? They might increase the wage rate of the lowest wage group. It has happened, for instance, in the case of Amazon, both in the US and in the UK, but of course that is not really decisive. So my conclusion is that if there is such a structural inequality problem in the US, and the inequality is going to further increase. And if a majority of respondents and voters is not convinced that policymakers should organize income redistribution through different tax systems and so on, then there will be always a kind of a winning majority of relatively poor people who are continuously frustrated as their share in GDP and national income is declining, and there is not much expectation, not much hope that anything turns better in the US. So we should not forget that Donald Trump was emphasizing in his 2016 campaign the forgotten men and women, so let's say these poor people. And it is also indeed remarkable that President Obama, when he was re-elected, he got about 63% voting shares from those with less than $30,000 annual income, while Hillary Clinton received only 53%, and that basically was a decisive swing. So we understand that this inequality problem is serious. The book emphasizes that the US president has not done much to correct this. If you look at, for instance, the income tax reform, it has been very much in favor of the super rich, so it was just the contrary of reducing inequality. Okay, there is considerable growth in the United States, but to some extent this is a result of deregulation, also of weakening environmental standards, of lack of climate protection policy, and there is also a very high government budget deficit, which is very unusual to have a very high deficit GDP ratio in an economic upswing. So that raises the question, what would happen if there is a major recession in the future? So the book then compares also the standard of living in the US and Europe, particularly in Western Europe and also in some of the Scandinavian countries. The Council of Economic Advisors in the US under President Trump had emphasized in a publication in 2018, but also in 2019, that the US is way ahead in per capita income based on purchasing power parity, and also to some extent in per capita consumption, way ahead of Western Europe, or particularly the Scandinavian countries, but this is not true. If you take a look, as I do in this book, at economic figures which really make sense, and that is you correct for transatlantic differences in healthcare expenditures. So in the US, they spend about 17 to 18% of GDP for healthcare. In Germany and France, it's about 11%. Of course, in aging societies, the share will further increase, we understand, but there is a big transatlantic difference. So if we correct for this, then Europe has an advantage, particularly if we also take into account that the leisure time, so vacation and so on, in Western Europe is much higher than in the US. And I could say at the bottom line that, for instance, the US per capita income, effectively, the effective per capita income in the US is roughly the same as in Norway, in some of the Scandinavian countries, but also Western Germany and France are roughly the same as the US. And it's also interesting to note then that life expectancy is higher in Western Europe, 3 years higher than in the US. And also infant mortality in Western Europe is lower than in the US. So the US spends more on healthcare, but the performance is much weaker. The trade policy of US President Trump is quite contradictory, as is his fiscal policy. He's basically undermining the global economic stability, and this will have negative repercussion effects on the US itself. There's also an enormous problem that the US Trump administration was not able to replace the roughly 4,000 political appointees of the Obama administration. They could replace only about 3,000. The career risk obviously was too big that the Trump administration could get, let's say, outstanding experts from leading economic research institutions, and that means there is a big gap of skilled staff in such ministries as the Department of Commerce, also in Treasury. So if there would be an international economic crisis, I think the IMF experts would not really know to whom they would have to talk. And this is a serious risk then for us in Europe, for countries in Asia and Latin America, for the world economy. So this is a new book with many insights, also with some interesting modeling aspects. And it has been recommended by several leading US economists.